The grand estate stood like a silent witness to decades of power, wealth, and carefully guarded secrets. Its towering iron gates, once symbols of exclusivity, now seemed to tremble under the weight of the whispers that had spread like wildfire. No one had seen this coming, not the high-powered executives, not the family's trusted advisors, and certainly not the man who had spent his entire life believing he was the rightful heir. But fate, as it often does, had other plans. The guests at the estate's annual gala murmured among themselves, their champagne glasses trembling slightly in their hands. The announcement had sent shockwaves through the elite circle, the kind of people who believed that legacy was written in stone. At the heart of it all was a woman they had barely noticed before, a woman who had spent years blending into the background, quietly tending to the needs of the family. The nanny. She had once been the one wiping away tears, tying little shoes, and singing lullabies in the dim glow of a nursery nightlight. She had been the shadow in the grand hallways, the gentle voice that soothed restless nights. But now she stood under the glimmering chandelier, her presence commanding attention in a way no one could ignore. The papers had been signed. The ink had dried, and the empire, worth more than anyone could truly fathom, was now hers. How did this happen? How did a woman, who had once been nothing more than a caregiver, rise to take control of everything a son had spent his life expecting to inherit? That's what everyone wanted to know. And no one, especially him, was ready for the truth. He had grown up with the weight of expectation pressing down on him. His name alone had opened doors, his future mapped out from the moment he could walk. He was supposed to be the one in charge, the one calling the shots, the one continuing the legacy his father had built from the ground up. And now he stood frozen in disbelief, watching as everything he had been promised slipped through his fingers like sand. The whispers turned to speculation. Did she manipulate her way into this position? Was there a hidden affair? A secret deal made in the dark? Or had she simply been the only one who truly understood the man who had built the empire? The one who had been there when the walls felt too high, when the burdens became too much to carry alone. One thing was certain: this wasn't a mistake. It wasn't an accident, and it wasn't going to be undone. The world had changed in an instant, and the people in that grand room knew one thing: the fight for power was far from over. Because while she may have legally taken the throne, the man who had believed it was rightfully his wasn't about to walk away quietly. And neither was she. The real battle was just beginning. She could feel the weight of every stare, the unspoken questions hanging in the air like smoke. But she didn't flinch. She had spent years in the background, learning, observing, understanding the empire better than anyone ever realized. And now it was hers. She knew he wouldn't accept this quietly. He was standing rigid, his breath measured but sharp, his mind working behind those furious eyes. He had always been the golden child, the one everyone expected to take the reins. His confidence had been built on certainty that one day, everything his father had created would be his. That certainty had just been shattered, and she could see the storm brewing beneath his surface. She wondered if he had ever really seen her before. Not as the woman who had raised him, not as the silent force who had kept things running behind the scenes, but as something more, as a threat, because that was what she was now. A threat to everything he had believed in, everything he had counted on. The room was still tense, the whispers growing louder. A few of his father's closest associates exchanged uneasy glances, waiting to see what would happen next. Would he lash out? Demand answers? Try to take back what he thought was his? But he didn't. Instead, he smiled. A slow, knowing smile that sent a chill down her spine. "So that's how it is," he said, his voice eerily calm. "You've been planning this for a long time, haven't you?" She held his gaze, refusing to give anything away. She wouldn't let him shake her. "Believe what you want," she said simply. The papers are signed." He let out a quiet chuckle, shaking his head as if he almost admired her audacity. "Almost. This isn't over," he murmured, stepping closer, his voice just for her now. "You have no idea what you've just started." She refused to be intimidated. She had made it this far, and she wasn't about to back down now. "I know exactly what I've started," she replied. And she did. But what neither of them knew was just how far this battle would go. The night stretched on, but the tension in the room never faded. People began to filter out in hushed conversations, but their curiosity lingered, their eyes darting back toward the two figures standing in the center of it all. She remained still, composed, even as she felt the weight of his stare pressing against her like an unspoken challenge. He didn't move, didn't say another word, but she could see the gears turning in his mind. He wasn't walking away, he was regrouping, calculating. He had spent his entire life knowing the rules of power, and now he was realizing those rules had changed. She wasn't just an unexpected player in this game. She had rewritten the whole thing. She finally turned, walking out of the grand hall with quiet confidence, but every step she took, she could feel his presence behind her. Not following, not yet, but watching, waiting. In the days that followed, the empire itself seemed to hold its breath. Employees whispered in hallways, investors hesitated before making their next move, and the press was already circling like vultures, waiting for a crack in the story. Inside the estate, the energy was different. The staff, who had once looked at her as nothing more than a caretaker, now regarded her with uncertainty, some with respect, others with suspicion. She had expected that. Trust wasn't something that could be inherited, it had to be earned. But the hardest battle wasn't with them. It was with him. She wasn't naive enough to believe he would just let this go. She saw it in the way he carried himself, the way he barely spoke but always seemed to be near. He wasn't trying to win people over. He was watching her, studying her, waiting for her to make a mistake. And she almost did. A week after the will was read, a late-night call came through. An emergency meeting. Something about missing funds, a suspicious transaction that shouldn't have been possible without the right access. When she arrived at the office, he was already there. Sitting at the head of the long boardroom table, casual, as if nothing was wrong. "You're fast," he mused, leaning back in his chair. "I wondered how long it would take you to get here." She didn't take the bait. Instead, she walked to the other end of the table, where the financial reports had been laid out, carefully marked to highlight the discrepancy. It was small, too small to threaten the empire just yet, but it was enough to cause concern. "You had something to do with this," she said quietly, scanning the numbers. He smirked. "I don't need to steal from my own company." "Not anymore," she corrected, looking up at him. His expression didn't change, but she saw it, the flicker of something behind his eyes. "I'm just saying," he continued, standing slowly. "It would be a shame if something like this kept happening. If investors started losing confidence. If the press got wind of it." He walked toward her, stopping just short of closing the distance between them. "You wanted control. That means dealing with problems like this. And trust me, they're only going to get worse." She clenched her fists, but forced herself to stay calm. This was a test. A warning. "You think you can push me into making a mistake," she said. "You think I'll crack under the pressure." He gave a small, knowing smile. "I think you don't understand what you've walked into." The challenge was clear. This wasn't just a battle over legal documents or titles. It was about control, influence. And the longer this dragged on, the more dangerous it would become. She had won the first round, but he wasn't done fighting. And neither was she. The days passed in a tense, almost suffocating silence. The estate was a battleground, but there were no visible signs of war, only subtle moves, quiet power plays, and an undercurrent of distrust that flowed through every room, every conversation. The empire seemed to pulse with a fragile energy, one bad decision away from shattering. It wasn't just about money or position anymore. It was about survival. She knew he wasn't done. The financial discrepancies were just the beginning. That late-night meeting had been his warning shot. He wanted to test her, to see if she would break, if she would show weakness. But she wouldn't. She couldn't afford to. Not now, not after everything she had fought for. Still, every corner she turned, every decision she made, she felt his presence lurking. It wasn't overt, but it was there, his shadow, hanging over her every move. He wasn't trying to win people over. No, he was waiting, watching, looking for a crack, a mistake. And she couldn't make one. But then, the phone rang again. This time, it wasn't a call for a meeting. It was worse. The press had gotten hold of a rumor, a story about financial instability, about a possible scandal involving the family's assets. It wasn't true, not exactly. But the seed had been planted, and the media would be relentless in digging for answers. She took the call in her office, her fingers pressing hard against the receiver. This was what he wanted. The world to question her, to wonder if she could hold things together, or if she would falter under the pressure. The journalists were already calling, asking questions she didn't have answers to, probing deeper than she was prepared to go. When she stepped out of her office, the staff moved a little more cautiously around her. The whispers had started again, louder now, and there was no escaping them. Some of them weren't just curious anymore. They were looking at her with doubt, with suspicion. She wasn't naive enough to believe everyone was rooting for her. Some were loyal to the old ways, to him. And then he appeared, standing at the far end of the hall, casually leaning against the doorframe, as if he had all the time in the world. He didn't speak at first, just watched her. She could feel the weight of his gaze, cold and calculating. "I warned you," he said finally, his voice low, almost too calm. "This is just the beginning. The press won't stop. The investors won't stop. You've made yourself a target. And I'm not the only one who's been planning, you know." Her stomach tightened, but she didn't flinch. She had learned long ago to mask her fear, to wear the mantle of authority, even when it felt like it was crushing her. "You think I didn't know?" she said, her voice steady. "You think I didn't see this coming?" His smile was barely there, a flicker of something dangerous behind his eyes. "You're smart, I'll give you that. But it won't be enough. Not when the whole world is waiting for you to fail." She squared her shoulders, meeting his gaze. The tension between them crackled, a battle of wills with no words needed. "Do your worst," she said, before turning on her heel and walking away. But even as she moved through the estate, each step felt heavier. She could hear his footsteps echoing behind her, not following, never following, but always there, lurking. He had set his plan in motion, and now it was just a matter of time before it unraveled completely. The empire was fragile. She knew that. But what she didn't know was how far he was willing to push to take everything from her. The game had changed. And this time, there were no rules. The days bled into one another, each one heavier than the last. She could feel the walls closing in, the pressure mounting with each passing hour. Every time she thought she had a moment to breathe, another problem arose. Investors were pulling back, the press had picked up a new angle, and even the most loyal members of the estate staff began to question her leadership. But through it all, she stayed calm. She couldn't let him see that she was rattled. She couldn't afford to show him that his whispers, his threats, were getting to her. But then, just when she thought the worst was over, something shifted. It came in the form of an anonymous letter, slipped under the door of her office late one evening. It was a simple thing, folded neatly with no return address, no signature. At first, she thought it was just another distraction, another small attempt at undermining her. But when she opened it, her fingers froze on the page. The letter didn't make sense at first. The words were cryptic, almost nonsensical. But as she read them again, the meaning began to clear. It was a warning, but not the kind she had expected. It wasn't about the media or the board of investors. It was about him. The letter revealed something she couldn't have imagined in her wildest nightmares, a hidden connection between her and the very man she had been fighting. A family secret buried so deep that no one, not even her, had known about it. The words on the page were clear. He wasn't just her rival. He wasn't just her adversary in this battle for control. He was something much more dangerous, something far more personal. The letter claimed that the man who had spent his life manipulating his way to the top, the man who believed everything was owed to him, was in fact her brother. Her pulse spiked. The paper trembled in her hands as she read the words again, trying to make sense of them. A brother? How could that be? She had never known him to be anything but the son of the man who had built this empire. How could they be connected? It didn't fit. But the details were chilling. The family's darkest secret, hidden away for decades, carefully erased from the records. A sibling she never knew existed. A bloodline she never thought she shared. The letter was unsigned, but its contents were too specific to be a simple fabrication. If this was true, if there was even a shred of truth to it, everything she thought she knew about her life, about her place in this family, had just been called into question. Her mind raced. Could it be true? Could he have known? Had he been playing this game all along, with more at stake than just power? Was this all part of a larger plan, one that she was only now beginning to understand? It didn't make sense. But then again, nothing about the past few weeks had made sense. The letter was just one more layer to peel back, one more puzzle piece to fit into an already broken picture. She couldn't ignore it. She needed answers. But she knew that the only way to get them was to confront him, to dig deeper into the family's past, into the hidden corners of their empire, and to face whatever truths lay waiting in the dark. The stakes had just been raised, and this new revelation changed everything. She wasn't just fighting for control of the empire anymore. She was fighting for her identity, for the very truth of who she was. But she wasn't the only one who had been forced into a corner. The game had shifted, and the tension between them, now thicker than ever, was about to reach its breaking point. He was her rival, her opponent, and now, possibly, her brother. She couldn't back down now. Not when everything was on the line. And yet, as she prepared to face him, a new unease settled over her. What if the truth was more dangerous than she could have ever anticipated? What if confronting him would unleash something darker, something neither of them could control? She couldn't think about that now. The first step was clear. She had to find him. And when she did, she would ask him the one question that had been haunting her since she'd read that letter. What do you know about the past? The estate felt colder that evening. It wasn't just the weather. It was the weight of everything hanging in the air. She had known she couldn't put this off any longer. The letter had changed everything. The truth was out there, and it was only a matter of time before it all came crashing down. She couldn't stay in the dark about this. She had to face him. The office door opened with a quiet creak as she stepped inside. He was already there, sitting at the head of the long table, his posture relaxed as if he had been expecting her. His eyes flickered with something unreadable, but his lips stayed pressed into a tight, controlled line. "I know why you're here," he said, his voice a low hum, just loud enough to make her heart race. "You've seen the letter." She didn't respond right away. There was no need to say anything. She didn't need to ask him if it was true. She already knew. The words, the accusations, the names she had never heard before. Everything lined up too perfectly to be coincidence. Instead, she crossed the room and took the seat across from him. She couldn't show him how rattled she was. She had spent too long being underestimated to let him see the cracks in her resolve. "So it's true?" she finally asked, her voice steady but sharp. He let out a small, bitter laugh, his eyes darkening as he leaned forward slightly. "True? It's more than true. It's the truth. that no one wanted to face. The truth that your father kept buried for years. But you're right. I'm your brother. And you were never meant to know. Her breath hitched. She had suspected it, but hearing him say it out loud made the weight of it feel heavier than she could have imagined. Why didn't he tell me? Why keep it a secret? He shook his head, almost as if pitying her. Do you really think you were ever meant to be part of this world? Do you think he wanted you to be anything more than a shadow in the background? You were a tool, just like I was. But unlike you, I wasn't content with just being the help. Her stomach twisted. So, you've been playing me from the start? He smiled, but it wasn't warm. I wasn't playing you. I was teaching you. Every step of this empire, every choice, every mistake. I watched. I waited. And now, I'm here to take what's mine. For a moment, silence hung between them, thick and heavy. The truth, ugly and raw, was finally out in the open. He was more than just a rival. He was a part of her past, her blood, and now her enemy. But there was something more in his eyes, something that told her he wasn't finished. She had spent too long focusing on the empire, on control, that she had missed the most dangerous game he'd been playing all along. You think you can just walk in here and take everything? She asked, standing up, her voice trembling with a fury she could no longer hide. You think you can tear this all down after everything we've built? He stood too, his movements deliberate, slow. I don't think. I know. Then, just as she opened her mouth to say something else, there was a loud bang. A sharp, deafening sound. She spun around in shock, her heart pounding. The door had burst open, and standing in the doorway was someone she never expected to see, her father. He was alive. The man she had thought was long dead, the man whose empire she had inherited, was standing right there in front of her. His face was older, weathered, but his eyes were unmistakable. I'm sorry it had to be this way, he said, his voice rough but clear. But you needed to know the truth. Her father took a slow step forward, glancing between her and the man who had once been her rival. Her brother. You both have a place here, he continued, the weight of his words heavy in the air. But you need to understand something. This empire was never about power. It was about control. Control of the truth. Control of what the world sees. And now, it's time for you both to decide where you fit into this story. Her mind raced, trying to make sense of it all. Her father alive, not dead as she had been led to believe, had been watching everything unfold from the shadows. He had been the one pulling the strings all along, making sure they both ended up here, at this exact moment. But just as the shock began to settle, her father's words took on a darker tone. I never wanted either of you to have this empire. It's too much for anyone. But you, my children, are the ones who will tear it apart. Her brother laughed, a cruel, twisted sound. I already have. And that's when everything changed. Her father's eyes narrowed, and for the first time, she saw something that chilled her to the core, fear. He wasn't in control anymore. The room erupted into chaos. Her father lunged toward her brother, but it was too late. In one fluid motion, her brother reached for the hidden gun on the table and fired. Time slowed. She watched as her father crumpled to the ground, the empire's very foundation shaking beneath her feet. Her heart pounded in her chest, the truth settling in with the brutal clarity of the final shot. This wasn't just about legacy. It wasn't about power. This was about survival. And now, the battle for control of the empire had just begun. Her brother stood over their father's body, breathing heavily, and turned to her with a final wicked smile. Now, he said, his voice a whisper, the real game begins. The gunshot still echoed in her mind, long after the noise had faded from the room. She stood frozen, her breath caught in her throat, her heart pounding violently in her chest. For the first time, everything the empire, her family, her entire life, felt like it was slipping away from her, piece by piece. Her brother stood over their father's lifeless body, his chest rising and falling with a controlled intensity. There was no remorse in his eyes, no hint of guilt. His actions were calculated, methodical, as if he had been waiting for this moment his entire life. He was the one who had always been ready to take what was his, but now the stakes had escalated in a way neither of them had expected. "What do you think you're doing?" she asked, her voice trembling but defiant. He didn't answer at first. Instead, he walked slowly around the table, his steps heavy, his gaze unwavering. When he finally spoke, his words were laced with venom. "You never understood, did you?" he said, his voice quiet but intense. "It was never about the empire. It was about power, control, and everything they kept hidden from us. The things they thought they could bury. The things you were too naive to see. This was always meant to be mine." Her father, the man who had built the empire from the ground up, lay in front of her, but his death wasn't the only thing that haunted her. The weight of her brother's words settled heavily in the space between them, pulling her deeper into a web she hadn't seen coming. Everything she had worked for, everything she had fought to protect, suddenly seemed fragile, as if it might crumble at any moment. "I never wanted any of this," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "I just wanted to keep it together. I just wanted to protect what he built." Her brother smirked, a cold, calculating expression spreading across his face. "You think you're any different from me? You think you didn't want this all along?" She shook her head, disbelief mingling with fury. "I didn't kill him. I didn't destroy the family." He stepped closer, his gaze never leaving hers. "You didn't have to. You're part of it now, whether you like it or not. And now that he's gone, the question is simple: what do you want?" She didn't know what to say. The empire, the family, the secrets, it was all unraveling so quickly, and she had no idea where to turn next. Was there a way to stop him? Was there even a way to survive this? For a moment, there was silence between them. The air in the room felt thick with tension, as if it were about to explode at any second. And then, without warning, he spoke again, his voice lower, more menacing. "I've been waiting for this moment my whole life. And now, it's mine." Her mind raced. She knew she couldn't let him walk away with everything. But what could she do? What options did she have left? Before she could say anything else, there was a loud noise from the hallway. She barely had time to react before the door to the office flew open and a handful of security guards rushed in. They had been the ones to hear the gunshot, and they'd come running, but their expressions were far from reassuring. Her brother didn't flinch. In fact, he seemed to relish in the chaos, in the uncertainty of the situation. "Get them out of here," he ordered, his voice sharp, commanding. The security guards hesitated, but they quickly obeyed, moving toward her father's body with a professionalism she had never seen from them. Her brother didn't take his eyes off her as the guards began to clear the room. "What now?" she asked, her voice thick with anger and fear. He smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "Now we see who really has the power."